My name is Zoe Davis. I'm 32 years old, and the moment I opened my front door last Tuesday night and saw my brother standing there, everything inside me froze. His name is Marcus, and for the last decade, he made it crystal clear that I didn't belong in this, that I was nothing more than dead weight dragging everyone down. But there he was, shoulders hunched, eyes red and desperate, asking if we could talk because he needed my help. The irony hit me like a punch to the chest. The same man who once told me I'd never amount to anything was now trembling on my doorstep, waiting for me to decide his fate. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I stood there staring at him, my hand still gripping the doorknob, remembering every cruel word he'd thrown at me over the years, like daggers meant to scar. Marcus had always been the golden child, the one our parents praised at every family dinner, while I sat invisible at the other end of the table, swallowing my dreams in silence. He had his corporate job, his fancy apartment, his condescending smirk whenever I dared to speak about my ideas. Now that smirk was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen on his face before: genuine fear. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what I'm about to tell you will show you exactly how the tables can turn when you refuse to stay down. Before I let him inside, before I heard whatever sob story he'd rehearsed on the drive over, I made a decision that changed everything. I decided to tell you this story from the very beginning, to show you how a girl who was told she'd never matter built something so powerful that even the people who rejected her came crawling back. This isn't just about revenge or proving people wrong. It's about what happens when you take all that pain, all that rejection, and turn it into fuel that burns so bright no one can ignore you anymore. What happened next that night with Marcus was just the climax of a journey that started years ago, and I need you to understand every step that brought me to that doorway, standing face to face with the ghost of my painful past. I need to be honest with you right from the start. I was always the daughter nobody talked about when relatives came over for holidays. While Marcus got the congratulations and the proud speeches about his achievements, I got polite nods and quick subject changes whenever someone asked what I was up to. My parents loved me in that obligatory way parents are supposed to love their children, but there was never pride in their eyes when they looked at me, never belief that I could be anything more than ordinary. Growing up in that house taught me one brutal lesson. If you're not born into a family's expectation, you'll spend your whole life trying to earn a seat at a table that was never set for you. But here's what nobody tells you about being the overlooked one, the forgotten daughter who doesn't fit the mold. It gives you a kind of freedom that the golden children never experience. When nobody expects anything from you, when nobody's watching or waiting for you to succeed, you can take risks that would terrify someone who's afraid of disappointing people. I learned to move in silence, to build my dreams in the dark corners of my bedroom while the rest of my family slept peacefully, convinced I was wasting my time. That rejection, as much as it hurt, became the foundation of everything I built, because it taught me that the only approval I needed was my own. This story isn't just about me getting rich or successful and rubbing it in my family's faces, though I won't lie, there's definitely some satisfaction in that moment we'll get to soon. This is about understanding that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who accidentally give us the greatest gift, the gift of self-reliance, of knowing we can survive without their validation. When Marcus showed up at my door that night, desperate and broken, I realized that my real victory wasn't the money or the company valuation. It was the fact that I'd learned to stand on my own 2 feet while he was still dependent on everyone else's opinion of him. And that difference, that fundamental shift in who held the power, was about to become painfully clear to both of us. I was 9 years old the first time Marcus told me I was a mistake in the wrong place, and those 6 words became the soundtrack to my entire childhood. We were in the backyard during a family barbecue, and I'd just shown my dad a drawing I'd made of a robot that could help people, something I was so proud of that my hands shook as I held it up. Marcus laughed so hard he nearly choked on his soda, then looked at me with that cruel older brother smirk and said those words loud enough for everyone to hear. Nobody corrected him, nobody told him to apologize, and my dad just patted my head and walked away to flip the burgers like nothing had happened. That moment didn't just hurt. It carved itself into my brain like a scar that never quite healed. The worst part wasn't the initial sting of those words, but how they kept showing up in different forms throughout my life, like a curse I couldn't break. When I struggled in math class, Marcus would walk past my room and mutter, "Mistake in the wrong place," just loud enough for me to hear. When I didn't make the soccer team, when I got rejected from my first choice college, when I cried after a breakup, there it was again. Sometimes spoken out loud, sometimes just implied in the way he looked at me with that mixture of pity and disgust. Those words became my internal voice, the default setting in my head whenever something went wrong, whispering that maybe he was right, maybe I really didn't belong anywhere. Make sure you're subscribed because what I'm about to tell you next shows exactly how I turned that poison into power. And drop a like if you've ever had someone's cruel words live rent-free in your head for years. But here's what happens when you hear something often enough. Eventually, you have two choices: believe it completely and let it destroy you, or use it as motivation to prove everyone wrong so thoroughly that those words lose all their power. I chose the second path, though it took me years to get there because first I had to wade through the swamp of self-doubt that Marcus and my family had created. Every achievement I dreamed about became tied to this desperate need to show them I wasn't a mistake, that I did belong somewhere, that I could be something they'd be forced to acknowledge. I didn't realize it then, but that phrase became the fuel I'd eventually use to build something they could never tear down. Something so undeniable that Marcus himself would one day stand at my door begging for the scraps of my success. The moment I truly understood I was on my own happened when I was 17, sitting at the dinner table trying to explain my fascination with technology and coding to a family that looked at me like I was speaking an alien language. I'd spent months teaching myself basic programming from library books and free online tutorials, staying up until 2 in the morning while everyone else slept, feeling like I'd discovered a secret world where logic made sense and hard work actually produced visible results. I was so excited to share this to maybe finally have something that would make my parents look at me the way they looked at Marcus when he talked about his business degree plan. Instead, my mom smiled that tight, uncomfortable smile and said, "That's nice, honey, but isn't that more of a boy thing?" Marcus, who was home from college that weekend, actually laughed out loud and said something that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. He looked right at me across the table, fork halfway to his mouth, and said, "Zoe, you barely passed algebra? You really think you're going to be some kind of tech genius?" Then he turned to our dad and added, "She's probably just going through a phase, like when she wanted to be a veterinarian until she realized it involved actual science." Our dad chuckled. Our mom changed the subject to Marcus's internship, and I sat there feeling like I'd been slapped across the face by every person who was supposed to believe in me. The potatoes on my plate blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Refused to give Marcus the satisfaction of seeing me break. That night, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling with my laptop glowing beside me, I made a promise to myself that would shape the next 15 years of my life. I decided that if they weren't going to support me, if they weren't going to believe in me, then I'd simply stop asking for their approval and start building something they couldn't ignore. I wouldn't tell them about my progress, wouldn't share my small victories, wouldn't give them another opportunity to tear me down before I'd even gotten started. This was the night I learned to walk alone, to trust only my own judgment, to find validation in the work itself rather than in the praise of people who'd already decided I wasn't worth their faith. And looking back now, standing where I am today, I realized that dinner table rejection was actually the greatest gift they could have given me because it forced me to become self-sufficient in a way Marcus never had to be. Something shifted inside me after that dinner table humiliation, like a switch flipped from seeking approval to proving them all wrong, in the quietest, most determined way possible. I stopped talking about my goals entirely and started pouring every ounce of free time into learning everything I could about technology, software development, and business strategy. While Marcus posted photos of his college parties and my parents bragged about his networking skills, I was in my bedroom at midnight watching coding tutorials, taking notes in journals I hid under my mattress, building small projects that nobody would ever see. The rejection that used to paralyze me with sadness transformed into something sharper, something that woke me up at 5 in the morning, with ideas burning in my brain that wouldn't let me rest until I'd written them down. I started viewing every doubt they'd planted in my mind as a challenge to overcome, rather than a truth to accept. When that voice whispered, "You're not smart enough," I'd spend an extra hour studying until the concept finally clicked. When I heard Marcus's laugh echoing in my memory, saying I'd never amount to anything, I'd channel that anger into perfecting a new skill or finishing another online course. My grades improved not because I suddenly became a genius, but because I was fueled by something more powerful than natural talent. I was fueled by the desperate need to prove that their assessment of me was completely, devastatingly wrong. Pain became my alarm clock, my coffee, my constant companion pushing me forward when exhaustion told me to quit. The beautiful thing about transforming pain into fuel is that it burns clean and hot, giving you energy that people who've never been rejected can't understand or replicate. Marcus had talent and opportunity handed to him, but he'd never had to fight for his place at the table, never had to claw his way up from the bottom while everyone around him predicted his failure. I realized that while he was learning how to network and schmooze, I was learning something far more valuable: how to rely entirely on myself, how to build something from nothing, how to turn whispers of she can't into a roar of watch me. That internal shift, that decision to weaponize my rejection rather than be destroyed by it, was the real beginning of everything that came after, the foundation of the empire I'd eventually build while they all slept soundly, completely unaware of what was growing in the shadows. By the time I was 24, I'd spent 7 years quietly building skills and knowledge while working dead-end jobs to pay rent for a tiny apartment across town from my family. I'd moved out the day after college graduation, declining their offer to stay at home until I figured things out, because I knew that staying meant suffocating under their low expectations. During those years, I'd been developing an idea that kept me awake at night, a software platform that could help small businesses automate their customer service without needing expensive tech teams. I'd noticed how many local shops and startups struggled with this exact problem, and I'd built a prototype in my spare time that actually worked, that actually solved a real problem in a way I'd never seen anyone else approach. One Sunday, during a rare family dinner I'd agreed to attend, I made the mistake of mentioning my project when my dad asked what I'd been up to lately. I explained the concept, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice because I knew what was coming, but still hoped maybe this time would be different. Marcus nearly spit out his wine, then looked at me with that same condescending expression he'd perfected over the years and said, "Zoe, that's adorable, but you realize there are billion-dollar companies already doing this, right? This is just delusion from someone who doesn't understand how business actually works." My mom patted my hand sympathetically, like I was a child who just announced I wanted to be an astronaut, and my dad changed the subject so quickly it was like I'd never spoken at all. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like, because the revenge gets so sweet you're going to want to share this with everyone who's ever doubted you. I left that dinner early, drove back to my apartment with tears of frustration streaming down my face, and made a decision that would change my life forever. I decided I would never, ever tell them about my business progress again until it was too big for them to ignore, too successful for them to dismiss, too undeniable for Marcus to laugh at without looking like a complete fool. I would build this in absolute silence, with no family cheerleaders, no proud parents posting about my journey on social media, no brother offering unsolicited advice based on his corporate experience. This startup would be mine alone, built in the quiet hours they knew nothing about, funded by savings they didn't know I had, driven by a vision they'd never believed. And when it finally succeeded, because I was going to make damn sure it succeeded, they'd understand exactly how badly they'd underestimated the mistake in the wrong place. For 18 months after that disastrous family dinner, I lived like a ghost, working my day job in retail management, then coming home to code until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. I pitched my platform to 47 investors during that time, attending every startup meetup and demo day I could find, perfecting my presentation in front of my bathroom mirror until I could deliver it in my sleep. 46 of them said no, some politely with feedback about market saturation, others brutally with comments about my lack of pedigree and connection. Each rejection felt like Marcus's voice echoing in my head, reminding me that I was delusional, that I didn't belong in this world of tech entrepreneurs and venture capital. But I kept going because quitting would mean proving them all right, and I'd rather die than give them that satisfaction. Then I met Sarah Chen at a Women in Tech networking event I almost didn't attend because I was exhausted and discouraged and ready to give up. She was an angel investor who'd built and sold her own company years earlier, and when I gave my pitch during the open mic session, she didn't interrupt me with skeptical questions or check her phone like so many others had. Instead, she leaned forward, eyes focused, nodding at specific points, and when I finished, she asked questions that showed she actually understood what I was trying to build. 2 weeks later, we sat in a coffee shop while she reviewed my prototype on her laptop, and then she said 5 words that literally changed my entire life. "I want to invest in, not this needs work," or "come back when you have traction." She believed in me, right then, exactly as I was. I cried in my car after that meeting, ugly sobbing tears that released years of pent-up frustration and self-doubt, because for the first time in my entire life, someone with power and resources had looked at me and seen potential instead of limitations. Sarah didn't care that I didn't go to Stanford, didn't care that I had no family connections in tech, didn't care about any of the things that had made other investors dismiss me before I'd even finished talking. She saw the work, the solution, the vision, and she saw something in me that my own family had never bothered to look for. That investment wasn't just money, though the $200,000 felt like winning the lottery. It was validation that I wasn't crazy, that my idea had merit, that maybe Marcus had been wrong about me all along. And with that first yes in my pocket, I went back to my apartment and worked harder than I'd ever worked before, determined to prove that Sarah's faith in me wasn't misplaced. Within 6 months of Sarah's investment, my platform had acquired its first 50 paying customers, small businesses who were desperate for exactly what I'd built and willing to spread the word to other entrepreneurs in their networks. I'd priced it affordably enough that it was a no-brainer for companies with tight budgets. But the real magic was how well it actually worked, how it saved them hours of manual labor every single day, and let them focus on growing their businesses instead of drowning in customer email. Word of mouth spread faster than any marketing campaign I could have afforded, and suddenly I was getting featured in small business blogs, then local tech newsletters, then larger industry publications that covered emerging startups. The growth wasn't just unexpected, it was explosive in a way that kept me up at night, wondering if it was real, or if I'd wake up tomorrow and discover it was all a dream. By the end of year 2, I had a team of 12 people working out of a shared office space, and we'd hit $2 million in annual revenue with profit margins that made even Sarah raise her eyebrows in pleasant surprise. Tech journalists started reaching out for interviews, asking about my overnight success story. Without realizing, I'd spent a decade preparing for this moment in silence while everyone around me predicted my failure. I was getting invited to speak at conferences, appearing on podcasts about women entrepreneurs, fielding emails from bigger investors who wanted to know about our Series A plan. The whole world seemed to suddenly see value in what I'd built, asking me for advice and insights, treating me like I had something important to say. Meanwhile, my family still had no idea any of this was happening because I'd kept my promise never to tell them until it was too undeniable to dismiss. The strangest part was checking social media and seeing my parents post about Marcus's promotion to senior manager like it was the greatest achievement in human history, while I was literally building something that was changing how thousands of businesses operated every single day. I'd scroll past their proud comments about his work ethic and dedication, biting my tongue against the urge to comment with a link to the latest article about my company's growth. But I didn't, because my victory wasn't going to be a social media post or a subtle brag at a family dinner. It was going to be so massive, so undeniable, that they'd have to confront their own blindness whether they wanted to or not. I was playing the long game, building something real while they celebrated mediocrity, and I knew that patience would make the eventual revelation so much sweeter than any petty "I told you so" could ever be. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was in a strategy meeting with my leadership team, discussing our expansion into international markets. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me excuse myself and step into the hallway to answer. It was David Park, a partner at one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley, and he said they'd been watching our growth for months and wanted to lead our Series B funding round. Then he mentioned a number that made my knees actually buckle. They were valuing my company at $80 million and wanted to invest $15 million to help us scale globally. I had to ask him to repeat it because my brain couldn't process that the thing I'd built in my bedroom, the idea Marcus had called delusion, was now worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. I somehow maintained my composure on the call, thanked David professionally, and scheduled a meeting for the following week to discuss terms. But the second I hung up, I slid down the hallway wall and sat on the floor in complete shock. $80 million. My name was now attached to a valuation that would put me in the same conversation as founders I'd read about in business magazines. People I'd admired from a distance, thinking I could never reach their level. The girl who was told she'd never amount to anything, who couldn't even get her family to believe in a simple software idea, had built something that venture capitalists were fighting over. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you next shows exactly what happened when my family finally found out. And drop a like if you think karma is real. The news broke 3 weeks later when the funding announcement went public, and suddenly my company was everywhere. TechCrunch, Forbes, Bloomberg, every major business publication running stories about the female founder disrupting customer service automation. My phone exploded with messages from old college acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years, distant relatives who'd never bothered to ask about my life, former coworkers who suddenly remembered we'd been so close. But there was radio silence from the people I actually cared about hearing from: my parents, Marcus, the family who dismissed me at every turn. I knew they'd seen it because my mom's best friend called to congratulate me, mentioning she'd sent the article to my mother. They knew. They'd read about it. They'd seen the numbers and the photos and the interviews, and yet none of them reached out. That silence spoke louder than any apology could, and it told me everything I needed to know about what would come next. Marcus showed up at my door exactly 11 days after the funding announcement went viral, and I knew the moment I saw his face that he'd rehearsed this entire encounter. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, the kind he used to make sure I noticed when we'd run into each other at family events, but something about him looked diminished, like the suit was wearing him instead of the other way around. His smile was too bright, too forced, and he started talking before I'd even fully opened the door. "Zoe, I've been meaning to call you. I saw the news about your company. That's absolutely incredible. I always knew you had it in you." The lie was so blatant, so absurdly transparent, that I almost laughed in his face. This was the same man who'd called my business idea delusion from someone who doesn't understand how business works. And now he was standing here pretending he'd been my cheerleader all along. I let him inside, more out of morbid curiosity than hospitality, wanting to see exactly how far he'd go with this charade before getting to his real reason for showing up. He walked through my house like he was cataloging everything: the custom furniture, the original artwork on the walls, the view of the city from my floor-to-ceiling windows, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He complimented everything with that same forced enthusiasm, asked surface-level questions about the company that made it obvious he'd only skimmed the articles without really understanding what I'd built. Then he settled onto my couch and finally dropped the act just enough to let the truth peek through. "So, I actually wanted to talk to you about something. I've been thinking about making a career change, and with your company growing so fast, I thought maybe there might be an opportunity for someone with my experience in corporate management." The audacity of it hit me like a physical force. He'd ignored me for years, mocked my dreams, dismissed my potential, and now he wanted me to hand him a job at the company I'd built specifically to prove people like him wrong. But what really got me, what made my stomach turn, was the arrogance still lurking beneath his desperate pitch. Even now, even while asking me for help, he couldn't fully let go of the belief that he was somehow doing me a favor by offering his expertise. His eyes still held that familiar condescension, that subtle implication that of course I'd need someone like him to help me manage real success, that I'd gotten lucky, but would eventually need a proper businessman to keep things running. He didn't see this as begging. He saw it as a mutually beneficial arrangement where he'd graciously rescue his little sister from her inevitable incompetence. And that's when I realized he hadn't actually changed at all. He'd just gotten desperate enough to pretend. After Marcus finished his pitch about joining my company, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of getting us drinks. But really, I needed a moment to decide how I was going to handle this. While the coffee brewed, I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I scrolled back through old text messages I'd never been able to delete, messages from Marcus that I'd kept like evidence of a crime I might someday need to prove. There they were, preserved in digital amber. "Stop embarrassing yourself with this tech stuff. You're making the family look bad." And another from 2 years later: "Mom told me about your startup idea. Please tell me you're not actually wasting money on that." And my personal favorite, sent just 6 months before Sarah invested in me: "I'm saying this because I care. You need to accept your limitations and find something you're actually good at." Reading those messages again with fresh eyes, standing in my $1 million kitchen while he sat in my living room asking for a job, I felt something break open inside my chest. These weren't just mean comments from a thoughtless brother. They were calculated attacks designed to keep me small, to maintain the family hierarchy where he was the successful one and I was the cautionary tale. Every single time I'd reach for something bigger, he'd been there to slap my hand away, to remind me of my place, to make sure I stayed beneath him where he was comfortable. And now that I'd broken free of that narrative, now that I'd become successful despite his best efforts to crush my confidence, he wanted to climb aboard my rocket ship and pretend he'd been supportive all along. The worst part was knowing that if I let him in, if I gave him this chance, he'd eventually find a way to take credit for my success or undermine my authority. Because men like Marcus don't change, they just adapt their tactic. I poured 2 cups of coffee and stood there staring at them, realizing this moment was about so much more than whether to hire my brother. This was about whether I was going to repeat the toxic cycle of prioritizing family loyalty over self-respect, whether I was going to let guilt and obligation override the lessons I'd learned through years of painful growth. My parents had taught me that family comes first no matter what, that you're supposed to forgive and help your relatives even when they've hurt you, that blood is thicker than water, and all those other platitudes that keep dysfunctional families locked in harmful patterns. But I'd built my entire company on the principle of surrounding myself with people who believed in the vision, who'd proven their commitment through action rather than words. If I wouldn't hire a stranger with Marcus's track record of dismissiveness and arrogance, why would I hire him just because we shared DNA? The answer was becoming clearer with every second I spent staring at those coffee cups. I wouldn't, I couldn't, and I shouldn't. I walked back into the living room and handed Marcus his coffee, then sat down across from him instead of next to him, a deliberate choice in body language that he didn't seem to notice. I looked him directly in the eyes and said something that clearly caught him off guard. Before we talk about job opportunities, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell me honestly why you're really here right now. His face flickered with confusion, then annoyance, like I'd broken some unspoken rule by refusing to play along with his script. He started with the same polished nonsense about wanting to be part of something exciting and believing in my vision, but I cut him off mid-sentence and asked again, slower this time. Marcus, tell me the real reason you're sitting in my living room asking me for a job after years of telling me I'd never succeed at anything. The mask cracked, just a little, and I saw something raw and ugly flash across his face before he got it under control. He tried a different approach, pivoting to flattery, talking about how he'd always admired my determination, even when he didn't understand it, how he'd been tough on me because he wanted to prepare me for a harsh world, how siblings sometimes express love through challenge rather than coddling. Each word was carefully chosen, tactically deployed, designed to rewrite history in a way that made him look like a misunderstood mentor rather than a cruel bully. But his eyes were darting around the room, landing on everything except my face, and his hands were fidgeting with his coffee cup in a way that screamed desperation. I let him talk himself in circles for a full 5 minutes, watching him try every manipulation technique in his arsenal, before I pulled out my phone and started reading his old messages out loud. His face went pale as I recited his own words back to him, each cruel text hanging in the air between us like evidence presented in court. Stop embarrassing yourself with this tech stuff. You need to accept your limitations. This is just delusion from someone who doesn't understand business. I watched him shrink with each quote, watched the last remnants of his arrogance collapse into something that looked almost like shame, but still he couldn't quite bring himself to tell the truth. He stammered out excuses about how those messages were taken out of context, how he'd been going through a stressful time, how he didn't remember saying those things, but if he did, he certainly didn't mean them the way they sounded. And that's when I realized something that fundamentally changed how I saw this entire situation. Marcus wasn't here because he'd had some profound realization about being wrong about me. He was here because he was desperate, probably in financial trouble based on the worn edges of his expensive suit, and he'd calculated that swallowing his pride was worth it if I could solve his problem. He still didn't actually respect me. He just needed me. And to him, that was close enough to the same thing. I set my phone down on the coffee table between us and took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me as I prepared to say things I'd been holding back for over a decade. Marcus, I'm going to be completely honest with you, probably more honest than I've ever been with anyone in our family. You're not here because you believe in my company or because you want to support me. You're here because something in your life fell apart, and you need me to fix it for you. His mouth opened to protest, but I held up my hand and kept talking, my voice steady and clear in a way that surprised even me. And the thing is, I would have helped you a year ago, maybe even 6 months ago, because I still had this pathetic hope that if I succeeded enough, if I became undeniable enough, you and Mom and Dad would finally see me as someone worth respecting. But sitting here right now, listening to you lie to my face about your motivation, I realize that's never going to happen. And more importantly, I don't actually need it to happen anymore. I told him I'd give him something, but it wouldn't be a job at my company. Instead, I'd connect him with a career counselor I knew who specialized in helping corporate professionals transition to new industries, completely free of charge. I'd also send him information about some companies I knew were hiring for positions that matched his actual skill set, along with tips for updating his resume to appeal to modern employers. But what I wouldn't do, what I couldn't do without betraying everything I'd built, was bring him into my company, where he'd have access to the thing I'd created specifically to prove people like him wrong. My team was full of people who'd believed in this vision from the beginning, who'd worked nights and weekends because they genuinely cared, who'd never once made me feel like I didn't belong. And I owed it to them not to poison that culture with someone who fundamentally didn't respect what we'd built or the woman who'd built it. Marcus's face went through a fascinating series of transformations: shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of indignant rage that I recognized from our childhood whenever he didn't get his way. He stood up abruptly, coffee sloshing over the edge of his cup onto my rug, and said things that would have destroyed me 5 years ago, but now just felt like confirmation that I'd made the right choice. He called me ungrateful, said I'd become arrogant and forgotten where I came from, accused me of abandoning family when they needed me most, all the predictable guilt trips that dysfunctional families deploy when someone finally sets a boundary. But here's what he didn't understand, what he couldn't understand because he'd never had to build himself from scratch. I hadn't forgotten where I came from. I remembered every painful moment with crystal clarity, and that's exactly why I was choosing not to go back there. As I watched him storm toward my door, still ranting about my ingratitude, I felt something I'd never felt before in my relationship with my brother, complete and total peace with disappointing him. After Marcus slammed the door behind him, I sat alone in my living room for a long time, just processing what had happened and waiting to feel guilty or sad or regretful. But those feelings never came. Instead, what washed over me was this profound sense of liberation, like I'd finally cut a rope that had been tied around my chest for my entire life, restricting my breathing without me fully realizing it was there. For years, I'd been carrying this invisible weight of family expectation and disappointment, constantly measuring my worth against their limited vision of who I could be. Even after I'd become successful, even after I'd proven them all wrong on paper, some part of me was still that 9-year-old girl desperately seeking approval from people who'd already decided she wasn't worth their faith. But sitting there in the silence after Marcus left, I realized that I'd finally, truly let that girl go and become someone who didn't need their validation to know her own value. The real triumph of my story isn't the $80 million valuation or the magazine covers or the fact that I built something successful enough to make my family come crawling back, though I won't pretend those things don't feel satisfying. The real victory is that I learned to define success on my own terms, to build a life surrounded by people who chose to believe in me rather than people who were obligated to love me but couldn't be bothered to see me. Sarah Chen saw my potential before I had anything to show for it. My team believed in the vision when it was just sketches and prototypes. My investors trusted me with millions of dollars based on the work I'd proven I could do. Those relationships, built on mutual respect and shared goals rather than shared DNA, taught me what genuine support actually feels like. And once you've experienced that, you can't go back to accepting crumbs from people who should have given you a full seat at the table from the start. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that cutting off toxic family members is easy, or that you won't have moments of doubt where you wonder if you're the one being unreasonable. There are still nights when I scroll past my parents' social media posts and feel a pang of sadness that we'll never have the relationship I once desperately wanted. But here's what I've learned through this entire journey. You can't build a palace while carrying people who are determined to keep you in a prison. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who refuse to see you. And sometimes the family you choose, the mentors, friends, and teammates who actually show up for you, is worth infinitely more than the family you were born into. I proved that I belonged, not to them, but to myself. And that's a victory that Marcus can never take away from me, no matter how angry he gets or how much he tries to rewrite history to make himself the victim in this story. So now I want to hear from you, because I know I'm not the only one who's lived through this kind of family dynamic where the people who should have supported you were actually the ones holding you back. Drop a comment right now and tell me about someone in your life who told you that you didn't belong, that you weren't good enough, that your dreams were just delusion, and then tell me what you did to prove them wrong, or what you're working on right now to prove them wrong in the future. I read every single comment, and your stories genuinely inspire me to keep sharing mine, because I think there's something powerful about knowing we're not alone. Experience of being underestimated by the people who were supposed to believe in us first. Whether it was a parent, a sibling, a teacher, a partner, or anyone else who planted seeds of doubt in your mind, I want to know how you turned that poison into fuel the way I did. And here's the bigger question I want you to really think about. Do you believe that success is the best revenge, or do you think there's something even more valuable than proving doubters wrong? Because honestly, standing in my living room after Marcus left, I realized the real win wasn't making him eat his words. It was reaching a point where his opinion of me literally didn't matter anymore, where I'd built such a strong foundation of self-belief that nothing he said could shake it. That internal shift, that moment when you stop performing for an audience of critics and start living for your own definition of success, is something I'm still unpacking even now. So let me know in the comments what you think the ultimate victory looks like when you've been rejected and dismissed your whole life. Because I genuinely believe everyone's answer to that question is different and equally valid. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the family scapegoat or the one nobody believed in, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because I've got more stories coming that dive deep into these themes of betrayal, resilience, and the complicated relationships we have with the people who raised us. Next week, I'm going to tell you about what happened when my parents finally reached out 6 months after the Marcus incident, and trust me, you won't believe the mental gymnastics they performed to avoid actually apologizing for decades of dismissiveness. Drop a like on this video if you made it all the way to the end, share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not crazy for setting boundaries with toxic family members, and I'll see you in the next one where we unpack even more of this messy, complicated journey of learning to choose yourself over people who never chose you.